Welcome, dear reader, to a candlelit corner of the old world, where superstition lingers like mist and inked pages still whisper of wolves and ruins, of letters sealed and secrets kept. Together, we'll read through the shadows of Bram Stoker's Dracula, chapter by chapter, hearthlight by hush. So brew something warm, light a candle if you like, and let's step quietly into the dark. If you'd like to support these deep dive literary explorations, you can find my Buy Me a Coffee, my favorite pen, and some fun notebooks, as well as basic versus bougie book options for this text, linked down in the video description. Thank you for helping me keep the candles lit. In Dracula chapter 4, we have Jonathan waking up in his room. And he's not entirely sure if the night before actually happened, if it was real or if it was a dream or hallucination. He can't be sure. And he mentions that every night he's pretty fastidious, or he's pretty careful to make sure that he winds his watch so that it continues running the next day. Nowadays we use watches with batteries that keep them going. But in decades past, you'd wind your watch to keep the gears in motion at the end of each day, or at the beginning of a day, or whichever. And his watch was not twisted. Reading this, I see this as a further indication of him being disoriented. It's even more of a distance from modern efficiency, that he is losing even his sense of accurate timekeeping. He goes on to talk about how his room has become a bit of a sanctuary for him, and that term in itself has this religious tone. And as a reader, we can see from even the first couple of chapters to now, Jonathan has completely changed in his attitudes towards kind of deep religious feeling and talk, and the significance of objects and even places. Then we have a journal entry from the 18th of May, and Jonathan goes and checks the door to the rooms that he had gone through to get to the rooms the night previous. And the door has been so forcefully closed that the wood itself is splintered on the door frame. Then the next entry right away is the 19th of May, and we have Dracula telling Jonathan to write 3 letters to Mina and his employer. Now, Dracula tells Jonathan to post date them for June 12th, 19th, and 29th. Now, keep in mind it's May. That's almost a month away. Well, that's more than a month away. Dracula instructs Jonathan that he is to write in these letters that he has left the castle and he's on his way home. Now, Dracula makes the excuse for him post-dating and writing these letters so far in advance by saying, you know, the postal service around here is not so reliable. Things can take a while. So this is going to give your friends ease of mind, because it's going to take that long for these letters to even get to them. So by the time these letters get to them, it'll be true that you are on your way to them, and, you know, they'll be less concerned when they haven't heard from you in ages. Jonathan, feeling like a prisoner here and being extremely distrustful of Dracula, and also having had that weird encounter with the 3 women and all of this, he sees these dates, these June dates, as really the countdown to his end, to his demise and his death. The next journal entry we get is about a week later. It's May 28th. Jonathan writes that a group of gypsies have arrived at Castle Dracula, and he refers to them with a word spelt S-Z-G-A-N-Y, which may be the Germanic or phonetic spelling of the Hungarian word for gypsies, which is Cigany. If I were to attempt to pronounce it, which I apologize if I do so inaccurately, would be the Cisgani. And Jonathan thinks that he can use the presence of these new people, these outsiders to the vampires he's living with, to his advantage in trying to escape. He does take a brief moment talking about the gypsies that have come and are camping. My understanding is kind of in the courtyard, like outside the castle, more on the castle grounds. And he explains that these people, they attach themselves to a great noble or lord, and he uses the term boyar, and they attach themselves to this person for protection. They give their loyalty and they get protection. He says that they are kind of outside the law. And when they've attached themselves to a boyar, they even call themselves by their name. So already we're getting textual hints that these people are probably going to be loyal to Count Dracula. Jonathan is just so desperate for any little fragment of hope, though, and he perhaps more associates the people who have come, these outsiders, with all of the kind townsfolk who were so concerned for his safety and giving him gifts and saying prayers over him. And so he does have this little bit of hope that they're going to help him. Now, they don't speak anything but their own specific dialect of Romanian, is my understanding. But nevertheless, Jonathan tries to communicate with them through, gestures and signals down from his window up above, from where he's looking down on them. At this part, I feel like this is kind of indicative of Jonathan's psychological decline. He honestly, somewhat pathetically and definitely irrationally, because he's not looking at any of these hints, and he's trying to communicate with people who he doesn't speak at all their language from a distance. There's so much separation between him and these people, and he should already be understanding that they are connected with Dracula, but he clings to this hope that they might be allies. Honestly, it's this mixture of courage and also tragic, I believe the word is naivety. He's very naive about this, but nevertheless, he writes private secret letters to Mina and Mr. Hawkins, his employer, and he somewhat basically explains his situation minus the frightening things that are happening to him. His letter to Mina he has written in shorthand so that it's even less readable to Count Dracula, who has only taught himself how to read, proper English. And also in his letter to Mr. Hawkins, he conveys to him, if a letter doesn't get to Mina, I need you to pass all of this along to Mina. He then takes these letters that he's written, he seals them and throws them out the window with a gold piece to one of the gypsies, who picks it up, bows, puts it in his cap, after Jonathan has tried to signal to him that he would appreciate if this man would mail it for him. And then later that evening, Jonathan is alone, but Dracula appears. He's got both of the letters. So, of course, the man turned the letters over to Dracula, and Dracula has them. And he has opened the one to Mr. Hawkins, and he doesn't seem to mind it. But the other one he wrote to Mina is written in shorthand, and Dracula looks at it. He looks very angry and says that it's a vile outrage on friendship and hospitality, and he burns it. Dracula then returns to being very suave and nice and says, I'm so sorry I opened this one. Why don't you go ahead and reseal it and go ahead and send it. Dracula then tells Jonathan, you need to go to bed, so go do so. And Jonathan does, and he says that he slept without dreaming. This little detail that Bram Stoker included, I think, can indicate this loss of inner resistance in Jonathan. Dreams are our subconscious working through fear, doubt, and identity. To sleep without dreaming may indicate that Jonathan's inner defenses are wearing thin. They're wearing down. Perhaps Dracula's influence is so pervasive that even Jonathan's unconscious mind is losing its resistance or personal expression. This sleeping without dreaming could perhaps also indicate a suspension of Jonathan's selfhood. Dreaming reflects our individuality, our imagination, and the soul's activity. The absence of dreams can maybe be showing us a pause in Jonathan's autonomy and his ability to make conscious or subconscious decisions for himself. His own humanity is almost becoming muted, almost as if he is becoming more an object in Dracula's domain than a free acting agent of his own fate and choices. This chapter specifically, we are also going to encounter vampiric sleep, and Jonathan himself falling asleep and not having dreams is a little bit of a foreshadow of that. Vampires are partially known for their dreamless and death-like slumber in the daytime hours. And this is perhaps a little bit of a foreshadow of Jonathan's own peril of perhaps slipping into an existence like that. And then we could brush all of that aside and say maybe him having a night's rest, not haunted by dreams, is perhaps a little bit of a tender mercy. Perhaps it is a little bit of a reprieve for him. Maybe this is a rare oasis for him from all of the horrors that he's been experiencing, that he's not even sure if they're dreams or reality. Maybe this is a little bit of quiet and peace for him. So I ask you, as a fellow reader or studier of Bram Stoker's Dracula, what do you think is implied by Jonathan having this night's sleep without dreams? Is he truly getting deep restorative rest, or is it a sign of his mind slowly and subtly being silenced? And perhaps this influences your perspective on it. He does end that paragraph by saying that despair has its own calms. This is perhaps a bit of a paradox. It's not the stillness from something being resolved and fixed, but is it a stillness from the erasure of resistance? The slow dissolving of someone's guards. The next entry that Jonathan puts into his journal is the 31st of May, and he wakes up and he finds that every scrap of paper, anything that would allow him to try and communicate with the outside world, has been completely removed from his room. In fact, not even things for communication, just even, I believe, papers about travel info. I have to imagine that this is making Jonathan feel like he's in one of those dreams where you are so trapped and yet you can't even scream for help. You are paralyzed from being able to do anything to get yourself out of a situation. He even mentions that he looks in his portmanteau, which is a type of suitcase, which that might be a fun little vocab word for you. It's a large suitcase that opens in two, and his outfit, his travel outfit, is gone. And so all of this, we should understand that Dracula has taken them. For what purpose? We're going to find out soon. We then don't get another journal entry until mid-June. It's the 17th of June. Jonathan is still a captive. This journal entry he has taken the time to write because even more gypsies have arrived, and this time they are bringing wagons full of empty wooden boxes, and they're unloading them and taking them into the castle for some use to Count Dracula. Then several days later, it's June 24th, Jonathan watches Dracula climb, scale down the castle wall like a lizard, wearing Jonathan's clothes. And he is sure that he has donned himself in Jonathan's apparel to go commit some crime, but make it look like Jonathan did it. Also probably to post the letters, to make it seem like he is, out in the community doing things of his own free will. And it's obviously concerning to Jonathan. Jonathan mentions that he decides to wait and see when Dracula is going to come back. And as he's waiting, he starts to see all of these flecks of dust in the moonlight and kind of like dancing in a very hypnotic way. He slowly starts to realize that they're condensing into the 3 devilish women, Dracula's 3 brides. And this time, thankfully, he recognizes the danger he's in. He is not paralyzed by fear or by their glamour of, this attraction to them, and he runs screaming. Then Dracula does return to his room. Jonathan is aware of this, and Jonathan says he hears a sharp wail that is very quickly suppressed. And very similar to perhaps the bundle that Dracula had a month ago that the 3 women devoured. So we need to understand this, that Dracula has once again taken a child. And Jonathan recognizes that Dracula is using his disguise to do these terrible things. And then we have this heartbreaking scene where a mother, she comes to the castle crying and wailing for her child. She sees Jonathan up in his window witnessing her, and she yells, "Monster, give me my child." And she's tearing at her hair and beating her chest, and with her bare hands violently pounding now on the castle door. And she is wrought with this deep, deep pain that her child has been taken from her. And she's kneeling and begging for her child to be returned to her. Now, somewhere above, Dracula is, I guess, witnessing all this too, and he summons a pack of wolves. They arrive and descend on the woman and devour her. Jonathan notes that he knows what has become of her child already, and he says he can't pity her because this fate was better than knowing what happened to her child. And let's see. Yeah, he says, "I could not pity her, for I knew now what had become of her child, and she was better dead." And I feel very strongly about this part. For me, it's a strong display of a woman's responsibility as a mother. And, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, we have this scene, and it's a mother standing at the door of Castle Dracula pleading desperately for her little one. She is frantic, heartbroken, and has come to the domain of essentially the devil himself to fight for her child. And she's confronting this darkness to try and reclaim the life of her child. I love her courage and her unwavering devotion. I believe the text itself is showing us how important the sanctity of human life is. This scene for me is more than gothic horror. It's a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about our human nature. A woman's love that she has when she becomes a mother should be sacrificial, selfless, and absolute. She embodies this woman in this scene, she embodies the instinct to protect, nurture, and preserve life. And for her, even in the face of unimaginable danger, it does not matter to her what the obstacles are to fighting for the life of this little human being. She is willing to face it. I believe that this instinct is not only personal, I do believe that it is the foundation of a moral and sustainable society. A culture that protects its truly most vulnerable and values its most vulnerable is one that can survive. A society that discards or diminishes the weak and the unborn or the dependent, doesn't matter what stage of human development they're at, the dependent, erodes its own moral and social fabric. The greatest human rights atrocities in history, genocide, enslavement, and systemic oppression, have often begun with the claim that the victim is less than human. When life is devalued at its earliest stages, justice, compassion, and human dignity unravel. This principle reflects this truth that every human life, from its earliest beginnings, is precious and worthy of protection. Just as this mother in Dracula risks everything for her child. Truly, what a horrendous death, but she faces that. She knew that she was going to the gates of hell. She risks everything for her child. I urge you to also recognize that life itself is sacred and foundational to a just and flourishing society. And I want this scene to challenge us. What happens when a society becomes so self-centered, so indifferent, that it sacrifices the most vulnerable simply because they are at a different stage of development? We don't know how young this child of hers was. Perhaps it was a baby. Perhaps it was a toddler. Perhaps it was a young child. We don't know. But in this mother's desperate cry at Dracula's door, we hear a universal message. Life is worth standing for, worth fighting for, and worth loving with every fiber of our being. Consider the world that we wish to build. Are we a society that cherishes and safeguards its weakest, or one that quietly condones their loss? The answer, I truly believe, begins with each of us, with the choices we make, the words that we speak, and the value that we assign to every human life. So we then have Jonathan. He says, "What shall I do? What can I do? How can I escape from this dreadful thrall of night and gloom and fear?" And just as a little closer look at a unique word that we don't use as much, is looking up the word thrall. And as I looked into it, it is connected to Old Norse, and it means being not free and being bound to a master or lord. So when you are caught in a thrall, you are under another's power, influence, or control. And so Jonathan, more than ever, is feeling that fear and gloom and nighttime are his master and lord. The next journal entry we get, continuing in chapter 4, is the 25th of June, and I want you to notice the journal entries are getting close together. There was that gap previously. Jonathan wakes up, and the sunrise, the sun itself, the sun and how it's hitting the gate opposite him that he can see out his window is giving him a lot of bravery. He knows that while he is infused with this bravery, he needs to take action while it's in him. A little symbolic note that I want to spend a minute on is Jonathan remarks that the sunlight on the gate opposite his window reminds him of a dove. Not just any dove, but the biblical dove that is associated with the story of Noah's Ark. Now, biblically, the dove is connected with the Holy Spirit. And so there's definitely this element of divine help Jonathan is sensing right now. In my reading of it, I also see the presence of this dove for Jonathan as a bit of a juxtaposition, a bit of a highlighting one thing by putting its opposite next to it. The dove in a lot of ancient cultures has been very symbolic and associated with the divine feminine. And so it's this juxtaposition to these evil vampiric women. The dove has this very strong and ancient link to the divine feminine, as I said. And this link lives deeply in both myth and religion. In Bronze Age Mesopotamia and Canaan, with the goddesses of those areas, the dove was associated with those goddesses and resonant of maternal instincts and feminine gentleness. The Grecian and Roman goddess Aphrodite, Venus, whichever, she was she was descended from another ancient goddess in it was either Syria or Phoenicia, and the imagery associated there was doves pulling her chariot. And so you see this repetition of doves being very sacred to mother goddess figures and being kept in their temples. I also want to note some very early texts emphasize the feminine grammar. The Hebrew word for spirit is feminine in its form. Jonathan has this, I would argue, Holy Spirit protection, but also this motherly support and embrace. So Jonathan, being infused with all of this, he decides to scale down the wall to Dracula's room. And there's an interesting little note here. He says he may die, but if he does, at least his life had meaning, and he's not just like some slaughtered calf whose life doesn't necessarily have meaning, but he's this human infused with purpose, and he may die, but he's going to know that it wasn't all for naught. Jonathan succeeds in scaling down the wall, though, and he makes it into a room that he describes as being just barely furnished, and what it is furnished with are kind of odd, that seem to never have been used. He even remarks that there's a pile of gold, and Jonathan says, it's at least 300 years old. And as I'm reading that, I'm kind of like, well, how does he know that? And so maybe that was your thought too. So I think Bram Stoker might have included that detail. One, because at the time that this is being written, there's a Victorian fascination with antiquity and with things that are old. Beyond that, though, you would probably be able to look at a coin that was made when your grandparents were young and notice that it looks older than a coin that was just barely made this year. So there are those surface cues. Also, older methods of making coins perhaps weren't as detailed and fastidious to detail as they would be as time advances. So there are those appearance details. And then I think, of course, Bram Stoker is just including this to further that narrative development of Dracula being excessively old. Not only does he hoard wealth, but he hoards centuries as well. So Jonathan, from this room, finds a dark winding stairway down, and he follows it, and he finds an old ruined chapel. Not only is this an architecture detail of a classic Gothic setting, but Jonathan notes that this chapel has a broken roof, and being someone who loves analyzing literature, I want to analyze that further. So a chapel itself is a house of God. It shelters the living and it sanctifies the dead. And a roof we can see as connecting to divine protection, a covering of divine protection. Now, if that roof of this ruined chapel is broken, suddenly the sacred space is no longer whole. Heaven itself is gaping inward. And there's a suggestion that faith or sanctity has been ruptured. And this place is no longer a sanctuary or a shield from corruption. Its brokenness now allows the profane, or in this case, the vampire, to invade what was once holy ground. We can also see this ruined sacredness as a perversion of death. Instead of a consecrated resting place, it becomes Dracula's lair. It's an inversion of Christian burial. The divine order of life and death has been fractured. A broken roof can also be seen as this broken barrier. Roofs are boundaries between human dwellings and the elements, between earth and sky, and perhaps even mortality and eternity. So when this boundary, this barrier is broken, the earthly and the supernatural are now intermingling without restraint. So Jonathan is essentially exposed not only to the sky, but also to spiritual powers beyond human law. There's this Gothic tradition in there where it's looking at the decay of institutions, be that aristocracy or religion. Especially religion, I feel like, is what this story of Dracula is all about. It's this returning of the past to haunt the present, and this level of beauty intertwined with dread. What was once glorious is now grotesque. It foreshadows Jonathan's sense of being unprotected. Law, religion, and reason of his world no longer are covering him here. So after Jonathan sees this, he continues on and he finds 50 boxes filled with soil in a passage. He opens several and Dracula is in one of them. Jonathan, he can't quite tell, it's not quite clear whether Dracula is dead or asleep. His eyes are open, but they don't have this glassy, stony look of someone who is dead, but he's somewhere in between. And this was a detail of vampire lore that I wasn't familiar with, so I had to go and look more into it. And a vampire sleeping on soil, apparently in Eastern European belief, a vampire must sleep on the earth of its homeland to retain its power. So the soil is the life source. We can think of this as death nourishing death. Dracula is recharging in the soil, which soil is what was once living. Now, you know, if you know a lot about gardening, you could say, you know, soil is full of life. But it's the result of previous generations of plant life and animal life in decay. And so decay is what is sustaining Dracula. And I also want to note that it's this threshold. The disturbed earth is this unsettled transitional liminal space, which is perfect for someone who is neither dead or alive, as a vampire would be. And this collapses the line between death and burial. In this case, a bed is also a grave. Seeing all of this, seeing Dracula, his undead state, terrifies Jonathan, and so he flees. The next entry we have is then June 29th, and Dracula greets Jonathan, doesn't seem to really be aware that Jonathan saw him sleeping, and he tells Jonathan that he can leave the next day. But Jonathan, he's done, and so he says, no, I want to leave right now, and he demands of Dracula to let him go right now. And then there's this moment where Dracula kind of gaslights Jonathan. He's like, oh yeah, no, I don't want you feeling that you're here against your will. Like, that's not the case at all. You can absolutely go right now. And so he opens the door for Jonathan, and immediately a ravenous pack of wolves is there and ready to devour Jonathan. And so he retreats. He's like, okay, no, I'm not going to leave today. And he has to stay. And there's also this interesting binary that we have here where the vampire is very connected with the wolves. And I find that interesting because, you know, whether you are a dog person or not, you've likely heard the term, a dog is a man's best friend. And so you have vampire and wolf, and then man and dog. And a dog is just a domesticated wolf over centuries and centuries and centuries. But anyway, then Jonathan is back in one of his rooms, and on the other side of the door he overhears conversation, and he hears Dracula tell the three brides that tonight he's mine, tomorrow he's all yours. And in response, Jonathan just goes to his room to pray. We then have the journal entry for the 30th of June, and Jonathan once again gets up and he goes to spy on Dracula's sleeping state again. Finding Dracula, we are given a far more disturbing scene, because this time he finds him in the same spot, but this time when he looks at him, he notices that, one, he looks younger. His hair is dark again, and some of the age from his face is gone. The disgusting part, though, is that there are, I believe, like trails of blood coming down from the corners of his mouth. And Jonathan describes him as almost leech-like because he is bloated with blood. And this is disturbing, one, just because of that leech-like imagery in human form. But also, I think we can guess at how this age reversal in the vampire was achieved. And Jonathan says, this was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come he might, amongst its teeming millions, satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. And I think perhaps we can understand what Bram Stoker was intentionally, maybe unintentionally, nodding at or trying to bring attention to. And I want to tread this connection carefully, but I think this is a very pertinent detail in the book that can relate to modern climate of politics and nations. And for many, I don't think it's just this, I don't think it's just about the vampires. I think it's about this vigilance against corruption. Jonathan sees that evil doesn't just destroy individuals, it seeks to colonize people and to reshape a nation's very soul. When we read this passage, I think there is a resonance for our own time. Nations today face a fear of losing a sense of sacred identity, of being reshaped by forces that don't honor their deepest values. Just as Jonathan suddenly grasped what was at stake, I think we too feel that tension. There is a ever-increasing need to discern what strengthens the heart of a nation and what corrodes it from within. And as I said, I find this book to be very spiritual in tone. So I sympathize with those who read this as more than politics. It's about what is protecting what is sacred, not only personally, but in our heritage, and what must not be surrendered to powers that feed on the vulnerable. So whether we read Dracula as a parable of spiritual warfare or a warning about cultural invasion, or both, its enduring power is the same. It reminds us that what is precious and holy must be guarded, because evil rarely storms the gates. More often it seeps in quietly until one day the roof has already been broken. And so then in realizing this, Jonathan takes it upon himself to do his utmost to prevent it. So he grabs a shovel and he's intending to kill Dracula with it. And so he brings it down, and to all of our dismay, it just it bounces off Dracula's forehead. And So again, Jonathan retreats. On his way out of Dracula's room, he takes some of the gold, and he states his intention that he's going to try and escape by scaling down the castle wall. And he ends the chapter, or rather ends the journal entry, by saying goodbye essentially to everyone, but most especially saying goodbye to Mina. And that concludes chapter 4. And it, for now, is a pause in Jonathan Harker's journal entries. The next correspondence that we are going to get is going to be from Mina herself. So, definitely let me know any thoughts, interpretations, disagreements that you may have with my analysis of the chapter. Let me know in the comments down below. I'm always open to conversation and deep diving into literature. Of course, just be respectful and kind, and don't forget to return for the next chapter's analysis. If this video brought something to life for you, you can support my work through Buy Me a Coffee or explore the tools I use to create these series down below. Every little gesture truly does help keep this corner of bookish candlelight glowing.